Is a good lyricist a poet? And are poets born or made, or both? It's an old question. It was said about Shakespeare by a contemporary that he never blotted a line. The idea was about then, as it is now, that if you're able to write fast, that proves that you have command of the art that you're practicing, in that case, dramatic verse. But Ben Jonson, who was also a contemporary and a rival of Shakespeare's, said that he wished that Shakespeare had blotted 1,000 lines. In other words, he claimed that he could find faults in many of Shakespeare's published lines. The question's a bit more complicated than it seems. Let's take the case of John Clare, only relatively recently admitted to the canon of major poets writing in the English language. He didn't have the classical education that many of his near contemporaries had. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley. They all went to Oxford or Cambridge and studied Latin and Greek. And Byron even went so far as to say that if you didn't derive your idea of poetry from Latin and Greek poets, then probably you weren't going to be much good. But Clare was educated in a different way. He spent a lot of time listening to the songs that were sung in a pub near his house. And it seems likely that, rather like William Blake, he picked up a lot about the nature of song from listening to these songs, so that when eventually he did get hold of some bits of formal poetry, he read it with a mind that was already attuned to a different tradition. And so what he eventually came out with himself was different from most of his contemporaries, and that led to him being not treated as quite on an equal footing with them for a long time. But in our own time, he's been given his own sort of status. All these poets that I've mentioned so far are page poets, and they usually don't have any music associated with their writings. There are, little exceptions to that. In Shakespeare's plays, there are some songs that we do have the music for. There's the fact that William Blake called his most famous collection of poems Songs of Innocence and Experience, but we don't actually have the music. You can see already that this relation between song and poem is becoming a bit more complicated. Some people think that if you don't know the things that the famous page poets do, then you aren't a poet. You may be a lyricist, but the implication would be that that's somehow a lesser thing. Recently, a friend sent me a YouTube video of Clifford T. Ward, who was a 60s singer-songwriter and also for a while an English teacher, playing his song Home Thoughts from Abroad. Now, Home Thoughts from Abroad was the title of a poem by Robert Browning, the famous page poet. And somebody wanting to praise Clifford T. Ward said in the comments, if Robert Browning could have heard this, he'd have wished he'd written it himself. And then someone replied to that with, no, he wouldn't. He knew about metre and poetry. So the implication is, from the point of view of this commentator, that unless you know about what he's calling metre and poetry, whatever is meant by that, then you can't be a serious contender for poetic status. In my view, that answers simplification. It's a result of supposing that knowledge about poetry can only be communicated by reading page poets. And that certainly is one way, but it's not the only one. When Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, he wasn't awarded the Nobel Prize for songwriting, notice, but for literature. Many said he didn't deserve it. Still, he got it. Was this because he knows all about page poetry? No, it isn't. His reading is eclectic. In Chronicles, he makes what seems to me a revealing mistake about Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan. He includes it in a paragraph about long poems he'd trained himself to read. Now, he may have been thinking about The Ancient Mariner, which is long, but, Kubla Khan is fairly short. Does it matter? No. He's not sitting an exam. He's looking for what nourishes and inspires him. You've probably noticed that if you read the lyrics of a song that you don't know the tune of, you often can't tell, looking at the lyrics, how they ought to go rhythmically. If you take da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, then many people, perhaps most people, will recognise that That's the tune of a limerick. And quite often when you're reading arrangements of words that are set out like poems, you listen to see if there's anything like that that you recognise. If the poem that you're reading has a connection to a very well-known form, then you'll probably pick it up. So if you read, "He was an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three, by thy old grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me?" If you read that, you'd probably get the tune of it quite easily. It's a ballad, and the ballad tune is very well embedded in English-speaking cultures and other cultures too. But if you look at a lyric like Faster, mostly written by Richey Edwards with some input from Nicky, or a lyric like It's All Right Ma by Bob Dylan, you might not be able to tell, unless you already knew the tunes, how those lyrics go, what the rhythm of them is. The reason that there is this confusion about lyrics is that in page poetry, a system of conventions that's grown up over time, which enables you to organise the rhythms of the words as they're normally said in relation to an intuited structure of strongly stressed syllables and weakly stressed syllables that we call metre. And by reading lots of poems, you gradually are able to detect the presence of these metres in the words of the poem. Well, in music, the metre, that's to say the regularity of rhythmical pulse, is provided by the music. And then the words are fitted into that. Sometimes they fit very easily. They fit so easily that if you take the music away, you can still tell what the tune is. On other occasions, and that's true of many of the lyrics written by Richey Edwards, you can't tell, or you can't tell as easily. This problem is made a bit worse by the fact that quite often lyrics on, for example, AZ Lyrics or Song Facts, any of these sites, are often transcribed by fans of music who may not be very familiar with page poetry, so they arrange the lines how they think they should go. And sometimes this way of lineating the poem doesn't correspond very closely with the rhythms that the tune gives to the words. And that's confusing. Now, there are many great lyricists who understand both the page poet tradition and the song tradition. Examples of that would be Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, Neil Young. They're probably some of the most prominent. Many people want to call lyricists poets, and I think that they're right to do that. Why do they want to do it? Or why do we want to do it? Why do we want to say that, say, Richey Edwards is a poet? Not just a poet, but a very exceptionally gifted poet. Well, one reason for calling lyricists poets is that it's historically accurate. If you look at the word lyric, you can see, or you'll certainly see if you look it up in a dictionary, that it means pertaining to the lyre, the stringed instrument, a bit like a small harp, that may have been used to accompany some arrangements of words as far back as, let's say, the 5th century BC in, say, classical Athens, where Greek poets were writing lyrics, and it's certain that the tradition is older than that. In the Old Testament of the Bible, the book of Psalms, it's quite clear that those were originally songs because they quite often mention the instruments that should be used in connection with a particular psalm. This is very, very old, this tradition, and you could say that we are now living in a sort of renaissance of the lyric, because while there are lots of people who don't know any page poems, there are very few people who don't know quite a lot of songs. The second reason that it's appropriate to call lyricists poets is that there may be some special qualities in the wording that distinguish these writers from prose writers. Obviously, one of those differences is length. Even if you were talking about a folk singer who sings traditional ballads like Bob Dylan did when he was a young guy, the length of the longest folk song would still seem small by comparison with the length of the shortest novel. So most songs seem relatively compact. And in our era, they're often focused on emotional experience, particularly the emotional experience of the person that you imagine is singing the words. Another characteristic of the lyric, as opposed to other forms of writing, is that it often works by juxtaposition. So meaning is created by putting one thing alongside another. And our minds work in such a way that we try to make relationships between things which apparently aren't related. Then finally, in our own era, one of the characteristics that the lyricists often have is that they're obscure, and that the obscurity is perceived as meaningful. It's perceived as an appropriate way for talking about something which may resist being clarified. And anyway, clarity has its own misleading tendencies. Sometimes statements which are very clear are very misleading and very inaccurate, as the political life of the UK and other nations will demonstrate almost every day of the week. The final thing which I think makes us want to call some lyricists poets is the intensity of their drive for self-expression in this compact form. I'd call these people song poets: Elliott Smith, Jonathan Kelly, Nick Cave, Thom Yorke, Laura Marling, Richey Edwards and Nicky. These and many, many others all have this drive. Without it, it doesn't really make any difference what you know or don't know about poetry and songwriting. You probably won't be the sort of lyricist people want to call a poet. Let me now take a couple of examples of lyrics which seem to me superb and which have qualities that you find in page poems, but which are their own thing, their own special kind of poetry. So the first song is Bob Dylan's song, Man in the Long Black Coat. I'll just read the first stanza of it. Crickets are chirping, the water is high. There's a soft cotton dress on the line hanging dry. Windows wide open, African trees bent over backwards from a hurricane breeze. Things are noted about the natural world or the immediate surroundings, and they're presented as if they're in a meaningful order, but exactly what the meaning is, it's left to you to work out. Crickets are chirping, the water is high. That's telling us something about presumably the climatic conditions. There's a soft cotton dress on the line hanging dry. Now, at this stage, the fact that the dress is soft and that it's dry may not seem especially important, but I put it to you that as we go on in the song, those words start to acquire significance. Windows wide open, African trees, so it's hot, presumably African trees, bent over backwards from a hurricane breeze. Now, when I first read hurricane breeze, I thought it was an oxymoron, that if something is strong enough to be called a hurricane, it isn't a breeze. But I think on reflection it means the sort of breeze that heralds a hurricane. And then we get to two lines, the final two lines of the stanza or verse, which revise our sense of the significance of everything that we've had so far. Not a word of goodbye, not even a note. She's gone with the man in the long black coat. And now if you think of that soft cotton dress on the line hanging dry, you might think, well, it's soft like her touch, and it's dry because it's been there long enough to get dry, and she's not there to take it down. If you read that stanza and you didn't know the tune, I think you'd probably still be able to recognize it as a kind of poem. And you can hear something of its tune because of the way that the beats are organized within the lines. Somebody's seen him hanging around at the old dance hall on the outskirts of town. He looked into her eyes when she stopped him to ask if he wanted to dance, had a face like a mask. These are 4-beat lines, and you can recognize them if you're listening to try and identify any principle of regularity that might be organizing the words. But when you get to the next stanza, there's a bit more difficulty, I think. Preacher was talking, there's a sermon he gave. Well, that's okay. Preacher was talking, there's a sermon he gave. He said, every man's conscience is vile and depraved. Those two lines are okay. You can hear the 4 beats there. But with the third line, you get, You cannot depend on it to be your guide. Now, when you listen to Dylan sing these lines, he sings, you cannot depend on it to be your guide, putting a lot of emphasis on that too, which you wouldn't in speech perhaps, but he's doing it in order to make it fit the rhythm of the song. And then in the next line we get, when it's you who must keep it satisfied. Now again, that doesn't seem rhythmically to have a clear 4 beats, but the way that Dylan sings it is, when it's you who must keep it satisfied, meaning the conscience. And that emphasis on the it there makes the conscience seem like an impersonal force, rather like some kind of predatory force that you have to feed or placate. Dylan is an example of a lyricist whose lyrics often stay quite close to the forms of page poetry, and that I think is mainly because he's read an awful lot of page poetry and he grew up within the ballad folk song tradition, which often has very marked regularities of rhythm in its wording. But he does deviate from these regularities, not just often, but always in some significant way. He's hypersensitive to the way that small adjustments in rhythm can affect the delivery and hence the significance of words. Next, I'd like to look at a song written by Richey Edwards, mostly, and with some input again from Nicky, called Die in the Summertime, from the Holy Bible. This is quite a different thing. If you read it without knowing how it's organised rhythmically by James Dean Bradfield's way of singing these words, then I think that it's harder to see how they're organised. Scratch my leg with a rusty nail, sadly it heals. Colour my hair, but the dye grows out. I can't seem to stay a fixed ideal. Childhood pictures redeem, clean and so serene. See myself without ruining lines. Whole days throwing sticks into streams. I've crawled so far sideways, I recognise dim traces of creation. I want to die in the summertime, I want to die. Among the relevant things to consider would be that this is a lyric, a poem, written by someone or some people who are very attuned to poetry since modernism. T.S. Eliot always said that for him the representative year in modernism was 1910. So in the period, let's say, between 1910 and 1930, there was a huge shake-up in the arts. And that's when, for example, Picasso started putting eyes on people's cheeks and, generally reorganizing your sense of how to represent the figure. It's the period when Charlie Parker revolutionized jazz, and it's the period when Ezra Pound, great American poet, started filling poems with allusions to very different traditions from the Anglo-American one. Scraps of wording from other languages, many different meters jumbled together, lots of gaps in meaning that you had to fill by recognizing quotations from obscure sources. All of that stuff came in modernism. One of the works that was most influential in spreading this way of writing and thinking about writing was T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, which Richey Edwards definitely knew and probably studied. Now, around this time, the idea started to grow up that it was okay to write poems in what was called free verse. Now, Eliot was very careful to explain that there wasn't any such thing, strictly speaking, as free verse. He thought that if it was verse, it wasn't entirely free. And he said that you should always be able to hear the ghost of a traditional meter or regular rhythm within a line of poetry. But nonetheless, gradually, poetry became freer and freer until it started not to be so appropriate to tell people that you needed to listen for the metrical organisation of a poem. And Richey Edwards is learning to write, I think, within the context of postmodernist thought. It's clear from the other writers that he reads Camus and Foucault and Nietzsche. He's very much in favour of exploring traditional paradigms and unsettling them. One of the paradigms that he wanted to unsettle was the paradigm of having very regular rhythms in writing. He said explicitly that he didn't like lyrics which just bobbed along in a predictable way. He often wanted to roughen them. When he was writing, and he often was writing lyrics independently of music, usually ahead of the music, he said that sometimes after he'd been working with James E. Bradfield for a while, he could sort of hear the kind of tune that James E. Bradfield would come up with for some of his lyrics, but still that in itself shows that he's writing the lyric before the tune is written. In this lyric, I think it's quite hard to detect the regularities that are so easy to detect in the Bob Dylan lyric. And for that reason, when James E. Bradfield sets this to music, he has to impose regularity by sometimes distorting pronunciation and cramming lots of syllables together. So if I read this lyric now, in accordance with the tune, you'll perhaps get a sense of how it changes. Scratch my leg with a rusty nail. Sadly, it heals. Colour my hair, but the dye grows out. Can't seem to stay a fixed ideal. Childhood pictures redeem. Clean and so serene. See myself without ruining lines. Whole days throwing sticks into streams. That's very different, and it gives Richey a lot of freedom to write like a postmodernist poet. When Richey Edwards tried to commit suicide, he left a note which is regarded by some as a suicide note, and in that he said he didn't want a particular fuss made at his funeral, but that he did want perhaps a poem to be read, and he mentioned a particular poem. The poem that he mentioned was Tulips by Sylvia Plath. I'll give you a stanza from Sylvia Plath's poem. Those of you who are familiar with Richey Edwards will probably see clear evidence of her influence on him. The poem imagines that she is in hospital and she's been sent some tulips, and she isn't very pleased about them. This poem has a lot to do with Richey Edwards' lyric, Roses in the Hospital. In the middle of her quite long poem, Plath says, "The tulips are too red in the first place. They hurt me. Even through the gift paper I could hear them breathe, lightly, through their white swaddlings, like an awful baby. Their redness talks to my wound. It corresponds. They're subtle. They seem to float, though they weigh me down, upsetting me with their sudden tongues and their colour. A dozen red lead sinkers round my neck." But if you go back to Richey's lyric, as well as the rhythmical audacity and irregularity of it, there is a lot of indeterminacy. That's to say, there are many places where it's quite difficult to be sure what exactly is meant. You can establish a range of possibilities, but you can't usually decide absolutely between them. It's very clear that this starts off with a willingness to confront the gruesome and also to surprise you with its own emotional development. Scratch my leg with a rusty nail. Most people would think of that as a bad thing, a way of hurting yourself that was dangerous and therefore to be avoided. The next word is sadly, it heals. Already in those first words, you've got an implication that to create a wound and have it not heal is desirable. Colour my hair, but the dye grows out. I can't seem to stay a fixed ideal. Now, putting those two things together creates a surprising tension. If you just had the colour my hair passage, then it would just imply that attempts to look a certain way were very difficult to sustain. Because of the scratch my leg with a rusty nail, sadly it heals, you have to think that what's being complained about here is any sort of impermanence, whether it's the impermanence of a look that you try to have when you're living, or the impermanence of staying dead. That's shocking. Childhood pictures redeem, clean and so serene. See myself without ruining lines, whole days throwing sticks into streams. Well, if the writing stopped at see myself without ruining lines, then you'd interpret these lines as being about aging and about being able to look at photographs of yourself when you were younger and without lines that have subsequently come and, from a certain point of view, ruined you. But then you have whole days throwing sticks into streams. Now, it's usual to take that as meaning this is an elderly person with nothing to do. But of course, it could also be a child with nothing to do. The one state is traditionally thought of as not so good, and the other state is traditionally thought of as good. As a whole, it's a bit confusing. And then the chorus, I crawl so far sideways, I recognize dim traces of creation. The crawling sideways will put most people in mind of a crab, I think, though again, that's indeterminate. It may be the case that what's implied here is that he's moved to the side of a state in which he could see creation. Now he's moved sideways, and he can only see dim traces. But it could also mean that having moved to one side of normality, the paradigms of other people's expectations, he's able to recognize at least a dim trace of creation within existence, rather than just the randomness. The final verse is, the hole in my life even stains the soil. My heart shrinks to barely a pulse, a tiny animal curled into a quarter circle. And then again, this unsettling final line, if you really care, wash the feet of a beggar. That's an allusion, obviously, to feet washing in the New Testament, and Christ's having washed the feet of the disciples. And here again, Nicky and Richey seem to be saying, demonstrate the extent of the compassion that you claim by caring for people that are socially outcast. And there's a very radical skepticism at work there. The final stanza of the song, the final verse, starts by encouraging you to feel sorry for the speaker. My heart shrinks to barely a pulse, a tiny animal curled into a quarter circle. But then that same speaker apparently issues a challenge. If you really care, wash the feet of a beggar. And that's a sort of characteristic Richey manoeuvre, and Nicky Wire does it a lot too, where the point of view is suddenly altered, so that the feelings that you were having are then suddenly rebuffed. These are complex states of emotion. To imagine what was the state of emotion of somebody who would write a lyric like that is difficult. But it leads us back to the question of what it is that we admire in the lyricists that we want to call poets. I think that ultimately the great lyricists are involved in what the psychologist D.W. Harding once called the creation of concepts. Most of the time, we think within pre-formulated concepts. The phrases that we use are very often phrases that we've encountered before, and we learn ingenious ways of putting them together. But occasionally, we need something different in order to express an elusive state of feeling. We may need ambiguity, we may need indeterminacy, we may need sudden shifts of point of view. These writers don't just use existing ideas, they develop, refine, and expand them so as to enrich our sense of what it is to be fully alive. To wish for somebody that they should have life and have it more abundantly seems a good wish. This is the gift that the best lyricists give us. In their attempt to make sense of their experience, they help us to understand and value our own.